My name is Sophia White. I am a 34-year-old African-American woman, and for the last 7 years, I've played the role of a quiet, penny-pinching high school librarian to keep my husband's fragile ego intact. He thinks I'm a broke liability dragging down his social status. What he doesn't know is that I am the sole heir to the White Family Trust, a billion-dollar real estate empire. Today, I'm going to tell you how I let his own arrogance completely destroy him. If you're listening from somewhere far away, drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this has traveled. And please, stay with me until the end. It was a freezing Tuesday morning, January 10th, 2026 to be exact. The winter wind was howling against the windows of our modest 2-bedroom apartment. I was standing in the kitchen, wearing a faded gray cardigan over my pajamas, pouring a cup of generic store-bought coffee. We drank the cheap stuff because my husband John insisted we needed to cut back on frivolous household expenses to fund his networking budget. John walked into the kitchen, bringing with him the overwhelming scent of Tom Ford cologne and the crisp rustle of a brand new, tailored Armani suit. At 36 years old, John was a man desperately holding on to his youth and fighting tooth and nail to climb a corporate ladder that had stopped caring about him a decade ago. He was a mid-level regional sales manager, but if you looked at his Instagram or listened to him talk at dinner parties, you'd think he was the CEO of Wall Street. He spent 20 minutes that morning meticulously buffing his Italian leather loafers, ignoring the fact that I was scrubbing the oatmeal crusted onto his breakfast bowl. "This collar is totally stiff," John grumbled, tugging at his necktie as he checked his reflection in the microwave door. He didn't say good morning. He rarely did anymore. I dropped $40 at the dry cleaners, and they still can't get a simple starch right. It's ridiculous. "Good morning to you, too," I said softly, sliding a plate of eggs across the counter toward him. He ignored the food, leaning against the counter and letting out a heavy, theatrical sigh. "Look, Soph, we need to talk about Liam's wedding." Liam was John's younger brother, a sweet but incredibly naive 38-year-old who had somehow managed to get engaged to Victoria Kensington. Victoria, at 32, was the ultimate social climber, a quintessential mean girl who spent her days curating her aesthetic and looking down her surgically enhanced nose at anyone who didn't carry a Birkin bag. She had made it painfully clear from day one that she thought I was tacky, old, and completely out of my depth in her presence. "The wedding is in 2 weeks," I replied, taking a sip of my bitter coffee. I already picked up the navy dress from the tailor. John winced, scrubbing a hand over his perfectly moisturized face. "Yeah, about that. I've been trying to find a way to tell you. Victoria called me last night. You know how her family is. Her dad, Richard, is a major heavy hitter in commercial real estate. They are basically East Coast royalty." I raised an eyebrow, keeping my expression entirely neutral. And, John continued, speaking quickly to avoid my eyes, "the venue is the Rosewood Coastal Club in Newport. It's an ultra-exclusive, invite-only country club. Because of some high-profile guests Richard invited, politicians, hedge fund guys, security is insanely tight. Victoria said the vetting process was brutal. They had to slash the guest list at the absolute last minute." He finally looked at me, wearing a practiced expression of fake pity. "Unfortunately, since you're not immediate blood and you work in the public school system, you didn't exactly make the cut." I stood there, letting the silence stretch between us. The hum of the refrigerator suddenly sounded deafening. "Let me get this straight," I said, my voice steady and calm. "Your brother is getting married, and I am disinvited from the wedding because his fiancée thinks a 34-year-old librarian is a security threat?" "Don't be out of pocket about this, Sophia," John snapped, instantly defensive. "It's not about you being a threat. It's a vibe thing. It's a super bougie crowd. They're going to be smoking expensive cigars and talking about venture capital. You don't even like that stuff. You'd just be sitting in the corner all night." He adjusted his cufflinks, puffing out his chest. "I have to go. I'm the best man. Plus, this is a massive networking opportunity for me. If I can rub elbows with Richard Kensington, I could finally land that VP role I deserve. I can't be babysitting you all night while I'm trying to run with the big dogs. You understand, right? You don't want to hold me back." I looked at the man I had married 7 years ago. When we met, I thought his ambition was charming. I thought he was a hard worker who just needed the right emotional support. I had purposefully hidden my background, introducing myself as a simple public school employee with a modest life, because I wanted to be loved for who I was, not for my portfolio. Over the years, I watched him change, I watched the ambition sour into arrogance. He maxed out credit cards to buy designer watches, fronting like a baller while secretly drowning in over $80,000 of debt. Debt he thought I didn't know about. I let him pretend to be the breadwinner, quietly transferring money from my private accounts into our joint checking just to cover the rent and his luxury car lease, preserving his fragile masculinity. And this was my reward, being treated like a dirty secret. Being hidden away so he could play the wealthy bachelor among people who would chew him up and spit him out. Of course, John, I said, forcing a gentle, submissive smile. I wouldn't want to embarrass you in front of the Kensingtons. You go. Make your connections. He let out a massive breath of relief, grinning like a teenager who had just gotten away with skipping class. That's my girl. I knew you'd be cool about it. You're the best, Soph. He grabbed his briefcase and gave me a quick, transactional peck on the cheek. I gotta run. Oh, since you're staying home that weekend, do you mind canceling the dog walker? Save us a few bucks. Sure, I murmured. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving me alone in the freezing kitchen. As soon as his footsteps faded down the hallway, my submissive smile vanished, replaced by a cold, hard line. John wanted to play the high roller at the Rosewood Coastal Club. He wanted to bow down to Richard Kensington's supposed old money empire. The irony was so rich it was almost suffocating. What my foolish social climbing husband didn't know was that the Rosewood Coastal Club didn't belong to the Kensingtons or their snobby friends. The parent company that owned the club, the grounds, and the marina was a subsidiary of White Holdings, my trust fund. I practically owned the grass John was so desperate to walk on. And Richard Kensington? I walked out of the kitchen and pulled out my encrypted work phone from the bottom of my sock drawer. I remembered seeing Richard's name cross my desk on a distressed asset report just a few weeks ago. He wasn't a real estate king. He was a desperate man drowning in a Ponzi scheme, practically begging my holding company for a bailout. I looked at my reflection in the hallway mirror. For 7 years, I had made myself small so John could feel big. I had worn faded cardigans and clipped grocery coupons, tolerating the disrespect and the silent snubs from his family. But as I stood there, feeling the cold air of a life built on a lie, I realized the time for playing the supportive, invisible wife was over. I wasn't going to cry. I wasn't going to scream. I was going to let John pack his designer bags, walk into that exclusive Newport Country Club, and smile for the cameras. And then I was going to pull the rug out from under his entire existence. 5 days passed. It was January 15th, and the tension in our apartment was thick enough to cut with a steak knife. I had seamlessly slipped back into my role as the compliant, understanding wife. I smiled when John practiced his toasts in the living room. I nodded when he complained about how much Liam's bachelor party at a downtown steakhouse had set him back, completely ignoring the fact that I had quietly transferred $1,500 into our joint account just to keep his debit card from declining at the dinner table. John was riding high, entirely consumed by the intoxicating illusion of high society. He spent his evenings aggressively scrolling through Victoria's Instagram stories, analyzing the Kensington family's country club aesthetic like he was studying for the bar exam. He was obsessed with finding the perfect wedding gift. Not something practical, mind you, but a showstopper. Something that would make Richard Kensington, the supposed real estate titan, look at John and think, now there's a guy I need on my executive board. You can't just hand a guy like Richard a blender, Soph, John had scoffed 2 nights prior, waving around a glossy catalog for luxury home goods. Victoria expects vintage, heritage pieces, stuff that screams old money. I gotta find something that proves I belong in the inner circle, but everything is insanely overpriced right now. I hadn't thought much of that comment at the time. I just assumed he'd end up maxing out yet another secret credit card to buy an overpriced crystal vase. I let it go. I decided to use that quiet Thursday afternoon to do a deep clean of the master bedroom closet. John was at the office, or rather, networking at a high-end golf clinic he couldn't afford, and the apartment was dead silent. I started by organizing John's ridiculous collection of designer shoeboxes. He had them stacked like a monument to his own vanity. As I shoved a pair of unworn velvet loafers to the side, I decided to clear out the very back corner of my side of the closet. It was a dusty, neglected space where I kept my old winter coats and a few plastic bins of holiday decorations. And beneath a heavy wool peacoat hidden completely out of sight was a simple, unassuming vintage cedar box. It wasn't a bank vault. It didn't look like anything special. To the untrained eye, it looked like a thrift store find where an old woman might keep some loose buttons or cheap costume jewelry. That was exactly the point. When you actually have money, you don't need to wrap it in a neon sign. I reached down to dust it off, my fingers brushing against the small brass latch. My heart completely stopped. The lock wasn't just open, it was busted. I dropped the dust rag. The brass clasp was bent outward, and the dark cedar wood around the keyhole was deeply gouged, as if someone had jammed a flathead screwdriver into it and violently pried it open. My hands started to tremble, a cold sweat instantly breaking out across my neck. I flipped the lid back. The hinges creaked loudly in the quiet room. The faded black velvet insert stared back at me. It was completely empty. I fell to my knees on the hardwood floor, frantically digging my hands into the velvet, lifting the insert, shaking the box upside down as if the laws of physics had magically hidden the contents. Nothing. Just an empty space where my grandmother's legacy used to sit. It wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was an imperial green jade brooch carved in the late Qing dynasty, surrounded by a halo of flawless, brilliant-cut Cartier diamonds. My grandmother, Eleanor White, the matriarch who built the White family trust from the ground up, had worn it every single day of her life. Before she passed, she pinned it to my lapel. It was the physical anchor to my identity, a family heirloom that carried a registered international appraisal value of $2.5 million. It even had a microscopic serial number laser engraved on the platinum backing, a security measure my grandmother insisted on decades ago. And now it was gone. For a wild, frantic second, I thought we had been robbed. I looked around the bedroom, but the TV was still mounted on the wall. John's expensive watch collection was still sitting untouched on his dresser. My laptop was still on the desk. A burglar doesn't break into a middle-class apartment in Queens, ignore a row of Rolexes, bypass all the electronics, dig under a pile of old winter coats, and steal a single vintage brooch from a locked cedar box. Unless the burglar actually lived here. The realization hit me like a freight train. The oxygen rushed out of my lungs, leaving me gasping in the middle of the closet. Victoria expects vintage, heritage pieces, stuff that screams old money. John's voice echoed in my head, sickening and clear. He didn't know what it was. Of course he didn't. To John, I was just Sophia, the broke, frugal librarian who clipped coupons and bought her cardigans on clearance. In his arrogant, superficial mind, there was absolutely no way his peasant wife possessed anything of real monetary value. He probably thought it was a piece of cheap costume jewelry, a pretty little knockoff I picked up at a flea market for $50. He saw a piece of green glass and some shiny rhinestones, and he figured it was the perfect zero-cost solution to his desperate need to impress his snobby future sister-in-law. He stole it. My husband broke into my personal belongings, vandalized my property, and stole a $2.5 million family heirloom so he could hand it over to a 32-year-old mean girl as a wedding gift. I sat back on my heels, staring at the broken cedar box. I didn't cry. The tears I usually shed for my failing marriage completely dried up, instantly replaced by a raging, white-hot inferno in my chest. This wasn't just a marital dispute anymore. This wasn't about him hiding credit card debt or disinviting me from a country club to save face. This was a felony. I slowly stood up, my knees popping in the quiet room. I walked over to John's dresser and looked at the framed photo of us from our wedding day. He looked so handsome, so full of promise. I had spent 7 years protecting that man from the real world. I had padded his bank accounts, stroked his ego, and swallowed my own pride just to keep him standing tall. I picked up the heavy silver picture frame and gently placed it face down on the wood. "You want to play with the big dogs, John?" I thought, my jaw clenching so hard my teeth ached. "You want to steal from the librarian to fund your fake lifestyle?" I walked out of the bedroom, leaving the closet door wide open. I didn't need to confront him. I didn't need to scream or throw plates against the wall. That's what a victim does. And as of this exact moment, Sophia the victim was dead and buried. I pulled my encrypted phone from its hiding spot. It was time to make a phone call to a very specific jeweler in Manhattan. If John wanted to give Victoria a heritage piece, I was going to make absolutely certain she wore it on her wedding day. Right up until the moment I slapped the handcuffs on him. I stood in the middle of our cramped bedroom, staring at the empty, violated cedar box. My mind was racing, connecting the dots with horrifying speed. John wasn't a criminal mastermind. He was a desperate, status-obsessed middle manager who left a trail of breadcrumbs wherever he went. If he was going to hand over a vintage piece of jewelry to Victoria Kensington, a woman who practically breathed designer labels, he wouldn't just hand it to her in a dusty old box. He'd want it presented perfectly. He'd want to put his own arrogant stamp on it. I grabbed my encrypted phone. I knew exactly where John went when he wanted to feel like a high roller. Whenever he got his meager end-of-year bonus, he would march down to Bartholomew and Company, a high-end, bespoke jeweler in the Diamond District, to buy himself a flashy watch or a pair of overpriced cufflinks. The staff there knew him as a big spender, mostly because John tipped aggressively to overcompensate for his maxed-out credit cards. My hands were remarkably steady as I dialed the number. I cleared my throat, channeling the sweet, slightly clueless persona of the supportive wife. Bartholomew and Company, this is Julian speaking. How may I assist you today? A polished, buttery voice answered on the third ring. Hi, Julian. This is Sophia Hanks, John Hanks's wife, I said, pitching my voice up a half octave, sounding perfectly pleasant. John asked me to call and double-check on the timeline for the surprise gift he dropped off. He's stuck in back-to-back meetings and is stressing out about it being ready for the wedding next weekend. Ah, Mrs. Hanks. Of course, Julian chimed, instantly warming up. John is a wonderful client of ours. And let me just say, that estate piece he brought in? Absolutely breathtaking. We rarely see imperial green jade of that caliber outside of museum auctions. The Cartier diamond halo is just exquisite. My stomach plummeted. So, the jeweler knew exactly what it was. But did John? It really is something. I forced a light giggle. Did John mention where he found it? He said he picked it up at an exclusive estate sale in the Hamptons years ago and was saving it for the right moment, Julian said with a chuckle. He wanted to make sure it was polished to absolute perfection for his future sister-in-law, Victoria. He really wanted to make a splash. An estate sale in the Hamptons. I closed my eyes. The sheer audacity of the lie made my blood boil. He had stolen my grandmother's legacy and was spinning a fairy tale to make himself look like a wealthy aristocrat. Well, you know, John, I said, gripping the phone so hard the plastic creaked. Is the polishing done? Yes, the ultrasonic cleaning is finished. It looks brand new, Julian replied proudly. We're just finalizing the custom engraving he requested. It should be ready for pickup by next Tuesday. The world seemed to stop spinning. The silence in my apartment suddenly felt like a vacuum. The engraving? I whispered, my sweet wife facade slipping for a fraction of a second. Yes, ma'am, Julian confirmed, oblivious to the fact that he had just dropped a bomb on my life. John was very specific. He wanted us to engrave the platinum backing of the brooch. It's going to read, "To Victoria, welcome to the elite. Love, John." It's a tight squeeze on the vintage platinum, but our laser specialist is handling it beautifully. I stopped breathing. You don't engrave a Qing dynasty antique. You don't take a laser to a historically significant $5 million artifact with a registered international serial number to write a tacky, pretentious message for a 26-year-old mean girl. He was defacing a piece of my family's history. He was permanently destroying the integrity of my grandmother's most prized possession, all to buy a fleeting moment of approval from people who thought he was a joke. Mrs. Hanks, are you still there? Julian asked, his voice filled with polite concern. I took a deep, shuddering breath. When I opened my eyes, the tears were gone. The hurt was gone. The only thing left was a cold, absolute, calculating clarity. I had spent my entire 20s and the first half of my 30s hiding my wealth, trying to build a normal, grounded life. I had played the frugal 34-year-old librarian because I wanted to believe that love was enough. I'm here, Julian, I said, my voice dropping its sweet pitch, returning to its natural, authoritative tone. Listen to me very carefully. You tell John his order is on schedule, but under no circumstances do you engrave that platinum backing. If he asks, tell him the laser machine is down for maintenance. Do you understand? Julian hesitated, clearly taken aback by the sudden shift in my demeanor. Well, Mrs. Hanks, John was very adamant. Julian, I interrupted, my voice sharp enough to cut glass. Do not touch the platinum. I will handle John. I hung up before he could respond. I tossed the phone onto the bed and stared at my reflection in the full-length mirror. I looked at the oversized gray cardigan, the cheap elastic hair tie, the sensible scuffed flats. It was a costume, a ridiculous, pathetic costume I had worn for 7 years to coddle a thief. I walked over to the closet. I didn't just take off the cardigan. I threw it into the trash can. I picked up my encrypted phone again and dialed a number that wasn't saved in my contacts, a number I knew by heart. It rang exactly once before a crisp professional voice answered. White Holdings, Office of the Chief Counsel, Harrison speaking. Harrison was the lead attorney and ultimate fixer for my family's trust. He had managed my assets from the shadows for years, silently respecting my wish to live a quiet life in Queens. Harrison, it's Sophia, I said, walking out of the bedroom and into the living room, my posture straightening with every step. There was a brief pause on the line. Ms. White, it's been quite some time. Is everything all right? No, I replied, staring out the window at the bleak winter sky. The sabbatical is over. I need you to initiate a full, aggressive forensic audit on my husband, John Hanks. I want to know about every hidden credit card, every outstanding loan, every dollar he spent in the last 5 years. Consider it done, Harrison said smoothly, not asking a single question. Anything else? Yes, I said, a cold smile touching the corners of my mouth. Pull the complete financial dossier on Richard Kensington and Kensington Commercial Real Estate. I understand he submitted a plea for a bailout last week. I want to know exactly how close he is to wearing a federal jumpsuit. Have the files ready on my desk. Your desk, ma'am? Harrison asked, a hint of surprise in his normally stoic voice. I'll be at the Manhattan office tomorrow morning at 8 a.m., I said. Have security clear the private elevator. The quiet, supportive wife is dead, Harrison. It's time the queen went back to work. I ended the call. John wanted to run with the big dogs. He wanted to play the game of wealth, status, and power. Fine, let's play. But I wasn't just going to beat him. I was going to rewrite the entire rulebook and watch him drown in his own arrogance. The following morning, the Manhattan skyline looked less like a postcard and more like a jagged row of teeth against the pale winter sky. Usually, my Fridays started with a crowded, soul-crushing subway ride to the public high school where I pretended to care about the Dewey Decimal System. Not today. Today, a sleek, black, armored Lincoln Navigator was idling 2 blocks away from my apartment building. I had walked out the front door in my usual frumpy librarian getup, a beige trench coat and scuffed loafers, just in case John was watching from the window. He wasn't, of course. He was too busy inside, aggressively steaming a silk pocket square for whatever fake power lunch he had lined up. I slid into the plush leather backseat of the Navigator. The heavy door closed with a solid, satisfying thud, instantly cutting off the noise of the Queen's traffic. Good morning, Ms. White, the driver said, his eyes meeting mine in the rearview mirror. He was part of the private security detail Harrison kept on retainer for the trust. Morning, David. Take me home, I replied. 25 minutes later, we pulled into the subterranean VIP garage of the White Holdings Tower in the financial district. The building was a towering monolith of glass and black steel, 90 stories of pure, unadulterated generational wealth. My grandmother had bought the land it sat on back in the late 70s for pennies on the dollar, and now it was the crown jewel of my real estate portfolio. I stepped onto the private executive elevator. There were no buttons to push, just a biometric retinal scanner that blinked a soft green as it recognized my eye. The elevator shot upward, bypassing the buzzing trading floors and corporate offices, opening directly into the penthouse executive suite. The air up here smelled different. It smelled of rich mahogany, ozone, and absolute power. Before heading into the boardroom, I took a detour to my private residential wing. It had been meticulously maintained by the cleaning staff, untouched and waiting for me for years. I walked into the walk-in closet, stripping off the beige trench coat, the cheap polyester blouse, and those god-awful scuffed flats. I tossed them unceremoniously into a wastebasket. In their place, I pulled out my real armor, a sharp, impeccably tailored midnight blue Tom Ford power suit. I slipped into a crisp white silk blouse and fastened a pair of subtle, yet heavy diamond studs into my ears. I pulled my hair back into a severe, uncompromising style. When I looked in the floor-to-ceiling mirror, the submissive, penny-pinching wife was completely gone. Staring back at me was the ruthless 34-year-old billionaire CEO my grandmother had raised me to be. I checked my phone. John had just texted me. Babe, can you transfer $200 to the joint account? Need to grab drinks with some VP guys later. Networking hustle, I scoffed, tossing the phone onto the vanity without replying. I pushed through the heavy oak doors of the main boardroom. Harrison, my lead counsel, was already waiting at the head of a massive obsidian table. Flanking him were 2 of my top forensic accountants looking like they hadn't slept in days. Piles of heavily redacted financial dossiers and glowing iPads were spread across the polished wood. Ms. White, Harrison said, standing up and buttoning his suit jacket. He didn't blink at my sudden reappearance or the Tom Ford suit. He just slid a thick, red-tabbed folder across the table toward my empty chair. "Welcome back. I hope the commute wasn't too rough." "Cut the pleasantries, Harrison," I said, taking my seat and opening the folder. "Show me the rot." Harrison nodded to the lead accountant, a sharp-looking guy named Miller. "We'll start with your husband, John Hanks," Miller said, pulling up a digital spreadsheet on the main projector screen. "To put it bluntly, ma'am, the man is bleeding cash. He's been living completely on smoke and mirrors." I scanned the documents. It was worse than I thought. "He's currently sitting on $84,000 in unsecured credit card debt," Miller continued, highlighting a column in bright red. "He opened 3 separate high-yield credit lines using a shell LLC he named Hanks Executive Consulting. The LLC has 0 revenue. He's been taking out cash advances on one card just to float the minimum monthly payments on the others. He is 1 missed payment away from complete financial ruin." "And his job?" I asked, flipping the page. "He claims he's up for a VP spot." Harrison let out a dry, humorless laugh. "He's cooking his own books, Sophia. He was put on a performance improvement plan at his firm 3 months ago. He hasn't closed a legitimate sales account since last summer. He's not networking. He's day drinking at expensive hotel bars and putting the tabs on those maxed out cards." I leaned back in my chair, steepling my fingers. He was a complete fraud. He had stolen my $2.5 million heirloom to impress a family of strangers, all while teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. "All right," I said, my voice eerily calm. "Now tell me about the so-called East Coast royalty. Show me Richard Kensington." Harrison swapped the files, his expression turning grim. "This is where it goes from pathetic to federally criminal. Richard Kensington isn't old money, Sophia. He's a dead man walking." The projector screen flashed to a complex web of commercial property deeds and banking wire transfers. "Kensington Commercial Real Estate is a massive house of cards," Harrison explained, tapping a laser pointer against the screen. "Richard over-leveraged his prime real estate assets to quietly cover massive losses in an offshore investment fund. When the market dipped, he started shuffling tenant security deposits and escrow funds to pay off his early investors. It's a textbook Ponzi scheme, and the SEC is already sniffing around." I raised an eyebrow. "How desperate is he?" "Desperate enough to beg us for a lifeline," Harrison said, sliding a formal corporate request across the table. 4 days ago, Kensington submitted a blind plea to White Holdings. He's asking for a $15 million distressed asset buyout. He wants us to buy that his bad debt for pennies on the dollar so he can inject the cash into his firm and avoid a federal indictment. I stared at Richard Kensington's frantic, desperate signature at the bottom of the buyout request. The man who thought my presence would ruin the vibe of his daughter's exclusive wedding was currently begging on his hands and knees for my money to keep him out of a federal penitentiary. "Does he know who actually owns White Holdings?" I asked, looking up at Harrison. "No," Harrison shook his head. "The trust is completely blind to the public. As far as Richard Kensington knows, he's pleading with a faceless board of corporate directors." "Perfect," I murmured, a cold, predatory smile spreading across my face. Picked up a gold fountain pen and tapped it against the mahogany table. The pieces of the chessboard were perfectly aligned. John was a thief drowning in debt, desperately trying to impress a fake real estate titan. Victoria was a snob marrying into my family to secure her own delusional status. And Richard was a criminal begging for my mercy. "Here's what we are going to do, Harrison," I ordered, my tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. "You will process Kensington's buyout request. Let it pass the first round of underwriting. String him along. Make him believe that the $15 million bailout is a guaranteed done deal." Harrison's eyes widened slightly. "You want to save him?" "Absolutely not," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "I want him to feel safe. I want him to pop the expensive champagne at the Rosewood Coastal Club and walk his daughter down the aisle thinking he just got away with federal fraud." I closed the red folder with a sharp, decisive smack, and on the day of the wedding, right in front of his elite little crowd, I'm going to cut the parachute. The heavy silence in the boardroom hung in the air for a long moment after I delivered my order to string Richard Kensington along. I could see the quiet approval in Harrison's eyes. He knew exactly how I operated. At 34 years old, I was managing a generational empire that men twice my age couldn't even begin to comprehend. I didn't get to the top of White Holdings by being merciful to predators. I started to close the red dossier, ready to dismiss the forensic accounting team, but Miller, the lead accountant, cleared his throat. He looked slightly uncomfortable, shifting his weight in his expensive leather chair. "Ms. White, we aren't quite finished," Miller said, tapping his iPad. "There's a secondary complication, a rather massive one." I paused, my hand resting flat on the mahogany table. "Show me." The projector screen flickered, replacing Richard Kensington's desperate bailout request with a sprawling financial web centered around a smiling, heavily filtered photograph of Victoria Kensington. Victoria Kensington, Harrison took over, his tone laced with professional disgust. 26 years old, unemployed aside from her self-proclaimed title as a luxury lifestyle influencer. Her personal trust fund was secretly liquidated by her father 3 years ago to pay off SEC fines. She has absolutely zero liquid assets. Her entire designer wardrobe is either rented or bought on credit. I scoffed. So she's a broke socialite marrying my husband's brother for a safety net. That's a tale as old as time, Harrison. Liam makes decent money as an architect, but he's not rich. What's the complication? The complication is that she isn't just marrying him for his salary, Miller interjected, pulling up a series of scanned bank documents. She's marrying him for his 800 credit score. Liam Hanks is 28, has zero debt, and a spotless financial record. He's basically a unicorn in this economy. And, I pressed, leaning forward, and Victoria is taking him to the cleaners, Harrison said bluntly. 2 weeks ago, she convinced Liam to co-sign a massive, high-interest personal loan under the guise of paying for wedding incidentals. But that's just the appetizer, Sophia. The main course is federal wire fraud and identity theft. A new document flashed onto the screen. It was a home equity line of credit, a HELOC agreement, stamped and notarized. Victoria forged Susan Hanks' signature, Miller stated, pointing to the scribbled name at the bottom of the page. She put your mother-in-law's paid-off suburban home in New Jersey up as collateral. Victoria used Liam's pristine credit profile to push the approval through a predatory online lender. The funds, nearly $400,000, were wired straight into one of Richard Kensington's offshore shell accounts to keep his Ponzi scheme afloat for another month. I sat back, the air completely knocked out of my lungs. Victoria wasn't just a snob, she was a criminal mastermind in a rented Chanel suit. She was willingly sacrificing the financial future of her fiancé and rendering her future mother-in-law homeless just to buy her father a few more weeks of freedom. My mind immediately went to Susan Hanks. My mother-in-law was, to put it politely, an absolute nightmare. From the day John brought me home, Susan had made it her life's mission to remind me that I wasn't up to their standard. She constantly made passive-aggressive jabs about my librarian salary, calling my clothes bargain bin trash, and bragging to her country club friends about how John was the golden goose of the family. But despite how much I utterly despise Susan, nobody deserves to have their home stolen right out from under them by a 26-year-old sociopath. And Liam was essentially a human golden retriever. He was clueless, endlessly loyal, and completely blinded by Victoria's manufactured beauty. He was walking directly into a financial slaughterhouse, wagging his tail the entire way. "Do we have the IP logs for the digital signature on that HELOC?" I asked, my voice deadly quiet. "Yes, ma'am," Miller nodded. "The IP address traces back directly to Victoria's personal MacBook. We have a rock-solid paper trail. The FBI would have a field day with this." "But good. Package it all up. Secure the digital files and print 3 hard copies," I ordered, standing up from the table. The anger I felt wasn't a hot, blinding rage anymore. It was cold, calculated, and absolute. John stole my family's legacy to impress these grifters. And these grifters are actively destroying his family to save themselves. They all think they are the smartest people in the room. I buttoned my suit jacket, my eyes locking onto the glowing screen showing Victoria's arrogant smile. "I'll see you all on Monday," I told the room. "Have the legal team on standby. This weekend, I'm going to burn their little fantasy to the ground." Fast forward to Friday night, January 23rd, 2026, the eve of the wedding. The Rosewood Coastal Club in Newport, Rhode Island was the epitome of East Coast old money. Situated on a sprawling cliffside overlooking the Atlantic, it was a fortress of exclusivity. The sweeping driveways were lined with imported European sports cars, and the architecture was a stunning display of Gilded Age opulence. Inside the Grand Solarium, the rehearsal dinner was in full swing. Through the encrypted security cameras broadcasting directly to my secure tablet, I could see the entire pathetic charade playing out in stunning 4K resolution. John was holding court near the open bar, a glass of Macallan 25 in his hand, a drink he was charging to a room he couldn't afford. He was wearing his custom tuxedo, laughing a little too loudly at a joke Richard Kensington had just told. John looked like a man who believed he had finally arrived. He was constantly checking his cuffs, ensuring his stolen status was on full display, completely oblivious to the fact that his bank accounts were running on fumes. Across the room, Victoria was draped in a silk designer gown, holding onto Liam's arm like he was a shiny new accessory. Susan Hanks was fluttering around the VIP guests, desperately trying to insert herself into conversations with hedge fund managers, bragging about her son, the executive. They were all drinking my champagne, eating my caviar, and breathing my air, blissfully unaware of the guillotine hanging directly over their necks. I wasn't in the solarium. I wasn't in Queens, crying over a stolen brooch. I was standing on the tarmac of the downtown Manhattan heliport, the icy wind whipping at the hem of my wool coat. The twin-engine Augusta Westland helicopter was fully fueled, the rotors already beginning their deafening, rhythmic thwack, thwack, thwack against the winter air. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed the direct line to Gregory, the general manager of the Rosewood Coastal Club. He had been managing my Newport property for 4 years, and he knew exactly who signed his very generous paychecks. "Gregory," I said, raising my voice over the roar of the helicopter engines. "Miss White." Gregory answered immediately, his tone sharp and professional. "The penthouse suite has been prepped for your arrival. Your security detail is already on site and integrated with the club staff." "Excellent. How is the Kensington Hanks party enjoying the rehearsal dinner?" I asked, watching John on my tablet as he shamelessly flirted with one of Victoria's bridesmaids. "They are indulging, ma'am," Gregory said, a hint of disdain leaking into his usually neutral voice. "Mr. Hanks has ordered 4 bottles of vintage Dom Perignon to the head table. Richard Kensington has been treating the waitstaff like indentured servants all evening." "Let them eat cake, Gregory," I said, a dark smile playing on my lips. "Let them have the night of their lives. Let them rack up the biggest bill in the history of the club. But the second the clock strikes 6 a.m. tomorrow morning, the fantasy is over." "Protocol Omega, ma'am?" Gregory asked, his voice tightening with anticipation. "Protocol Omega, I confirmed. At 0600 hours, I want every single room key associated with the Kensington and Hanks party deactivated. I want their credit lines frozen. Cancel the bridal spa appointments, lock the minibars, and deny all room service. When their cards inevitably decline, do not let them charge so much as a bottle of sparkling water without a hard cash deposit." "Understood perfectly, Ms. White." "I'm boarding the chopper now," I told him, stepping toward the aircraft. "Have a secure vehicle waiting at the Newport landing pad. It's time the owner paid a surprise visit to her guests." I ended the call and climbed into the luxurious cabin of the helicopter. As we lifted off, leaving the glowing grid of Manhattan behind, I looked out over the dark expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. John thought he had successfully cut me out of his life to protect his fake image. He thought I was sitting in our tiny apartment, clipping coupons and waiting for him to come home. He was about to wake up in a nightmare he couldn't afford to escape. The sun rose over Newport, Rhode Island, on the morning of January 24th, 2026, casting a deceptively serene golden glow over the frost-tipped lawns of the Rosewood Coastal Club. It was a picture-perfect day for a high society wedding. Inside his standard guest room, which he mistakenly believed was a VIP suite, John woke up with a pounding hangover and an inflated sense of his own importance. It was 6:45 a.m. He stretched out on the Egyptian cotton sheets, grinning at the ceiling. Today was the day. Today, he was the best man in the wedding of the year, ready to rub elbows with the 1%. He reached for the bedside phone, dialing the concierge with the effortless arrogance of a man who thought the world owed him a favor. He was sharing the room with Liam, who was already up, pacing nervously in his pajamas. "Room service," John barked into the receiver, not bothering with a "good morning." "I need 2 Wagyu steak and egg platters, a carafe of your best mimosa blend, and a pot of French press coffee. Send it up to room 412. Put it on the card on file." There was a pause on the other end of the line. The voice that replied was polite, professional, and entirely detached. "Mr. Hanks, this is Chloe at the front desk. I apologize, but we are unable to process your order." John scoffed, rolling his eyes at Liam, who looked over with a frown. What do you mean you can't process it? Just charge it to the room. I'm the best man. We attempted to, sir, Chloe replied smoothly. However, the credit card on file has been declined. The system has flagged the account for insufficient authorization. John felt a sudden, icy prickle at the base of his neck. He sat up, lowering his voice so Liam couldn't hear his rising panic. Listen, there must be a glitch in your system. That's an Amex Platinum. It's got a massive limit. Run it again. We have run it 3 times, sir, the receptionist said, entirely unbothered by his tone. The issuer has placed a hard stop on all transactions. Furthermore, per club policy, since the primary guarantee method is invalid, we have been instructed to electronically lock your minibar and suspend all hospitality services until a valid form of payment is presented. John's knuckles turned white as he gripped the receiver. Do you know who I am? We are guests of the Kensingtons. VIP status is reserved for guests with active solvent accounts, Chloe said, cutting him off. As of 6 a.m., your status has been revoked. If you wish to eat, you are welcome to walk down to the lobby cafe and pay with physical cash. Have a wonderful wedding day, Mr. Hanks. The line went dead. John stared at the phone in absolute disbelief. He slammed it down onto the receiver. Everything okay, man? Liam asked, his voice tight with pre-wedding jitters. John forced a tight plastic smile. Yeah, bro. Totally fine. Just a stupid bank fraud alert because I dropped so much cash at the rehearsal dinner last night. I'll go down to the lobby and sort it out. He threw on a pair of designer sweatpants and a cashmere hoodie, grabbing his wallet with trembling hands. His heart was hammering against his ribs. The card had never declined before. He had been juggling minimum payments like a circus clown for 3 years, but the house of cards had never fully collapsed. Why today? While John was hyperventilating in the elevator, a similar scene was playing out in the club's ultra-luxe subterranean spa. Victoria Kensington and Susan Hanks swept through the frosted glass doors wearing plush white robes, expecting immediate royal treatment. Victoria was already loudly complaining about the humidity in the waiting area, blissfully unaware that her reign of terror had expired exactly 45 minutes ago. The spa director, a formidable woman named Elena who had received my direct orders, didn't offer them a tray of cucumber water. She stood behind the marble counter like a gatekeeper. I'm sorry, Miss Kensington, Elena said, her voice carrying clearly across the quiet lobby, catching the attention of a local senator's wife waiting nearby. We cannot accommodate you today, or ever. Victoria froze. She let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. Excuse me? I am the bride. I have the platinum bridal package reserved. My mother-in-law and I have appointments starting right now. Stop wasting my time and get the estheticians. Elena didn't flinch. She tapped her computer screen, turning it slightly so Victoria could see the flashing red banner across her profile. Your reservation was canceled automatically by our central system. Your name, along with your father's corporate account, has been flagged for severe credit insolvency. You are on the Rosewood Global Blacklist. We do not provide services to high-risk individuals with a history of payment default. The silence in the spa was absolute. The senator's wife slowly lowered her magazine, staring at Victoria with open, unfiltered judgment. Victoria turned a shade of violent, splotchy crimson. The humiliation hit her like a physical blow. This is a lie! She shrieked, slamming her manicured hands onto the marble counter. My credit is perfect. Put it on my fiancé's brother's tab. John Hanks. Mr. Hanks's tab has also been frozen due to suspected fraud, Elena replied icily. If you do not leave the premises immediately, I will call security to have you escorted out for trespassing. Susan Hanks gasped, clutching the collar of her robe, looking like she was going to faint from the sheer embarrassment of being publicly labeled a fraud in front of her country club peers. Meanwhile, up in the main lobby, John was pacing near the front desk like a caged animal. He had tried 3 different credit cards. All declined. He had 0 cash. He was cornering a young housekeeper near the service elevator, his voice dripping with desperation. I need to speak to Gregory, the general manager, right now, John hissed, grabbing the sleeve of the young man's uniform. There is a massive mistake with my billing. The housekeeper, who had been briefed by my security team 10 minutes prior, played his part flawlessly. He stammered, pointing a trembling finger toward the top floor. I don't know where Mr. Gregory is, sir. He's upstairs in the presidential penthouse. We've been dealing with a VIP situation all morning. Some woman named Sophia checked in last night, and she's been completely locking down the top floor. John stopped breathing. Sophia. His brain short-circuited. His broke, penny-pinching public school librarian wife was here, at the Rosewood Coastal Club. In his twisted, arrogant mind, it suddenly made perfect sense. I hadn't stayed in Queens. I had followed him. I was jealous. I was trying to ruin his big weekend. I had probably taken our one joint checking account debit card, driven up to Newport, and demanded a room just to embarrass him in front of the Kensingtons. Rage propelled him forward. He bypassed the guest elevators, which required key cards he no longer possessed, and sprinted for the emergency stairwell. He was going to drag me out of whatever standard room I was squatting in by my ear. He was going to scream at me until I cried. He threw the heavy metal door open on the top floor, breathing hard, his cashmere hoodie clinging to his sweating back. He stood before a set of massive double oak doors marked private residence, authorized personnel only. To John, this just meant I was hiding. He didn't knock. He planted his foot and kicked the doors open, bursting into the room like a SWAT team. "Are you out of your damn mind, Sophia?" he roared, expecting to find me cowering in a cheap cardigan, surrounded by room service I couldn't afford. But as his momentum carried him across the threshold, the words died in his throat. He wasn't standing in a standard hotel room. He was standing in the foyer of a 5,000 square foot, $20,000 a night penthouse. The sunlight streamed in through floor-to-ceiling glass walls that offered a panoramic view of the Atlantic Ocean. The living area was furnished entirely with custom Italian leather pieces. And there I was. I wasn't cowering. I was seated at the head of a massive marble dining table, wearing my midnight blue Tom Ford power suit, casually sipping a double espresso from a porcelain cup. Standing behind me, looking like a pair of lethal bodyguards, were Harrison, my lead counsel, and Gregory, the general manager of the club. John froze. His brain simply couldn't process the visual information. He looked from the marble floors to the velvet drapes, and finally his eyes landed on me. He blinked rapidly, like a man waking up from a coma. Sophia? He stammered, his voice sounding incredibly small in the cavernous room. "What is this? How did you get in here?" I didn't answer him. I took a slow sip of my espresso, placed the cup gently onto the saucer, and looked at him with profound, absolute boredom. John's confusion instantly morphed into his familiar, ugly arrogance. He took a step forward, pointing a trembling finger at me. "I get it," he sneered, though his voice shook. "You're working, aren't you? But not as a maid. Who is he, Sophia? Which rich old guy are you sleeping with to get access to a suite like this? Does he know you're married?" Harrison stepped forward, blocking John's path with the calm, terrifying authority of a man who charged $2,000 an hour. "Mr. Hanks?" Harrison said, his voice cutting through John's hysteria like a scalpel. "I strongly suggest you lower your voice. You are currently trespassing in a private residence." John scoffed, looking Harrison up and down. "Private residence? This is a hotel suite, you suit-wearing hack, and my wife is squatting in it to ruin my brother's wedding." "No, sir," Harrison corrected him, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles with weary patience. "You are laboring under a significant and embarrassing delusion. This penthouse is deeded separately from the club's standard operations. It is the permanent private residence of the chairwoman and majority shareholder of White Holdings, the entity that owns this entire property." Harrison paused, letting the silence crush the oxygen out of the room. "And as of this morning," Harrison continued, gesturing toward me, "Ms. Sophia White has officially revoked your status as a guest. Welcome to your wife's house, Mr. Hanks. Now get out before I have you arrested for breaking and entering." The silence that followed Harrison's declaration was heavy enough to crush bone. John's mouth opened, then closed. He looked at Harrison, then at Gregory, and finally back at me. He tried to reconcile the image of his frugal 34-year-old librarian wife with the woman sitting at the head of a multi-million-dollar penthouse, radiating absolute, terrifying authority. His brain was misfiring, completely unable to bridge the massive gap between his manufactured arrogance and the reality crashing down on him. That's a lie," John whispered, his voice cracking. He backed up a step, his expensive sneakers squeaking against the polished marble floor. "This is insane. You're a high school employee. I pay the rent. I give you an allowance for groceries." I set my espresso cup down on the saucer. The sharp clink echoed in the massive room. I stood up slowly, smoothing the midnight blue silk of my Tom Ford suit, and walked around the marble table. I stopped just a few feet from him. Up close, I could see the sweat beading on his forehead, his pupils blown wide with panic. You paid the rent on a cramped apartment I purposely kept to make you feel like a man, John, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of an anvil. I let you play the big, successful provider because I actually loved you. I wanted a partner, not a gold digger, but you asked who the rich old guy was? Look around you, John. I am the rich guy. I have always been the rich guy. He shook his head frantically, as if trying to physically dislodge the truth from his brain. No, I saw your pay stubs. I saw your bank accounts. You saw the decoy accounts I set up to protect my family's trust from people exactly like you, I countered smoothly. Tell me, John, did you really think your $75,000 base salary was covering a luxury apartment in Queens, a leased BMW, and $84,000 in hidden credit card debt? Did you really think you were financially surviving on your own? John flinched as if I had physically struck him. The mention of his secret credit card debt, the $84,000 he thought was buried deep in a shell LLC, shattered whatever fragile denial he had left. How do you know about that? He stammered, the color completely draining from his face, leaving him a sickly shade of ash. I know everything, I said coldly. I know you were put on a performance improvement plan 3 months ago. I know you haven't closed a deal since last summer. I know you've been taking out cash advances to pay for your overpriced cocktails and custom suits. I didn't just pay for our groceries, John. For the last 7 years, my trust fund has been quietly subsidizing your pathetic, desperate illusion of grandeur. John's knees actually buckled. He reached out and grabbed the back of a leather dining chair to keep from collapsing onto the floor. The arrogance was entirely gone, replaced by the dawn of absolute crushing horror. The woman he had treated like a peasant, the woman he had hidden away to protect his social standing, was the queen of the empire he was desperately trying to infiltrate. And then, a sickeningly predictable flicker of greed sparked in his eyes. He realized the implications. If I was a billionaire, that meant we were billionaires. He swallowed hard, forcing a grotesque, pleading smile onto his face. He took a step toward me, reaching his hand out. Soph, baby. Oh my God, I had no idea, but this is amazing. We don't have to worry about the debt anymore. We're married. We're partners. What's yours is ours, right? We can fix this. I'll quit my job tomorrow. We can... Harrison, standing by the window, let out a dry, razor-sharp laugh that cut John off immediately. Mr. Hanks, Harrison said, pulling a yellowed, stapled document from his leather briefcase and tossing it onto the marble table. It seems you have forgotten the heavily notarized document you practically forced your wife to sign 7 years ago. John looked at the document. His breathing hitched. It was our prenuptial agreement. You were so paranoid that your poor librarian wife would come after your meager 401k and your entry-level savings, I said, looking down at the paper. You hired a cut-rate lawyer to draft the strictest, most ironclad separation of assets legally possible in the state of New York. Article 4, Section 2. Any and all assets acquired prior to the marriage or acquired via inheritance or trust shall remain the sole and separate property of the original owner. Neither party shall have any claim to the other's separate estate, regardless of the duration of the union. I looked back up at him, my eyes dead and hollow. You wrote the rules to keep a beggar out, John. You just didn't realize you were locking yourself out of a kingdom. You don't get a single cent of my money. John let out a strangled, pathetic noise. He looked like a man who had just watched his winning lottery ticket blow into a blazing fireplace. Defeated, broke, and entirely outmaneuvered by his own arrogance, he slumped against the chair. Gregory, the general manager, checked his Rolex and stepped forward. Ms. White, should I have security escort him off the property? John looked up, his eyes wide with terror. If he was kicked out now, he would have to face Richard Kensington and his family with absolutely nothing. No money, no room, no status. No, I said, my voice slicing through the room. John let out a pathetic gasp of relief, thinking I was showing him mercy. He was wrong. I'm not kicking you out, John, I whispered, stepping right into his personal space, smelling the stale alcohol and raw panic radiating off him. Throwing you out now would be entirely too easy. If I kick you out, you'll just run away and spin some story about how I went crazy. I want you to go downstairs. I want you to put on your rented tuxedo. I want you to stand at the altar next to your brother, and I want you to watch Victoria walk down the aisle." "Sophia, please," John begged, tears actually welling up in his eyes. "Please don't do this. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." "Go to the wedding, John," I ordered, turning my back on him, "because I want you to have a front row seat when I burn your entire fake life to the ground. Gregory, have security escort him to the lobby. Make sure he doesn't try to run." 2 massive security guards in tailored suits stepped out from the hallway, grabbing John by the arms. He didn't fight back. He couldn't. He was dragged backward out of the penthouse, his eyes locked on me, searching for any sign of the submissive wife he used to know. But she was gone. The heavy oak doors slammed shut, cutting off his pathetic apologies. By 1 p.m., the manicured outdoor terrace of the Rosewood Coastal Club had been transformed into a breathtaking winter cathedral. Thousands of imported white orchids lined the aisle, and a string quartet played softly over the sound of the crashing Atlantic waves. The guest list was a curated collection of New England's elite, hedge fund managers, local politicians, and socialites, all bundled in expensive furs and designer coats. Down at the altar, John was sweating bullets. His tailored tuxedo felt like a straitjacket. He kept wiping his forehead with a handkerchief, shifting his weight from foot to foot, his eyes darting frantically toward the glass facade of the penthouse suite towering above them. Beside him, his brother Liam looked beaming and oblivious, eagerly waiting for his bride. Inside the bridal holding room, Victoria Kensington was looking at herself in a gilded full-length mirror. She looked undeniably stunning in her custom Vera Wang gown. But it wasn't the dress that caught the eye. It was the massive, flawless imperial green jade brooch pinned directly to the center of her sweetheart neckline. The Cartier diamonds caught the afternoon light, throwing a blinding halo of wealth around her. "You look like a queen, darling," Richard Kensington said, stepping into the room to offer his arm to his daughter. He looked exhausted, the stress of his collapsing Ponzi scheme weighing heavily on his shoulders, but today he was playing the part of the triumphant patriarch. "I know," Victoria smirked, lightly touching the stolen $2.5 million heirloom on her chest. "John really outdid himself with this gift. It screams old money. It's exactly what I deserve." And the wedding march began to play. Up in the penthouse, I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the terrace. I watched the doors open. I watched Victoria step out onto the aisle, the stolen brooch gleaming on her chest like a beacon. I watched Richard Kensington smile, thinking he had scammed his way to safety. I picked up a secure 2-way radio from the marble table. "Harrison," I said, my eyes locked on the bride, "tell the local authorities we are ready. Let's crash a wedding." The ocean breeze carried the delicate scent of thousands of imported white orchids across the manicured terrace of the Rosewood Coastal Club. The string quartet was playing a flawless, sweeping rendition of Pachelbel's Canon in D. To the 200 elite guests seated in the crystal Chiavari chairs, it was a picture of absolute, unshakable wealth. But from where I stood, watching through the glass doors of the Grand Solarium, it was nothing more than a beautifully decorated crime scene. Victoria Kensington glided down the aisle, her arm looped through her father's. Richard Kensington looked impossibly proud, his chin jutting out as he nodded to the local politicians and hedge fund managers in the front rows. He thought he was untouchable. Victoria's custom Vera Wang gown trailed over the white rose petals, but all eyes, especially mine, were fixed on the blinding imperial green jade brooch pinned to her chest. My grandmother's legacy paraded around as stolen valor. At the altar, Liam Hanks had tears in his eyes, completely mesmerized by the woman who was actively destroying his financial future. And then there was John. My husband, the best man, looked like he was standing on the trapdoor of a gallows. His face was a sickly, translucent shade of gray. He was sweating completely through his tailored tuxedo shirt, his eyes darting wildly between his brother, Victoria, and the imposing structure of the penthouse above. He knew the guillotine was dropping. He just didn't know exactly when the blade would hit. Richard handed Victoria off to Liam. The string quartet faded out gracefully. The officiant, an older man with a booming, theatrical voice, stepped up to the microphone. "Dearly beloved," the officiant began, his voice echoing over the crashing waves of the Atlantic, "we are gathered here today in this magnificent setting to witness the union of Victoria and Liam." I gave the signal to my security chief. A sharp, ear-piercing screech of audio feedback tore through the elegant silence. The guests winced, covering their ears as the officiant's microphone went completely dead. Before anyone could complain to the sound technician, the massive 12-foot oak doors leading to the terrace were thrown wide open. Not by the club's hospitality staff, but by two heavily armed Newport police officers. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The politicians in the front row immediately tensed, their personal security details shifting nervously. I walked out through the heavy doors, stepping into the harsh winter sunlight. I wasn't wearing a clearance rack cardigan. I was wearing my midnight blue Tom Ford suit, the diamonds at my ears catching the light. Flanking me were Harrison, my lead counsel, and two plainclothes detectives from the Rhode Island Financial Crimes Unit. I didn't rush. I walked down the center aisle with the slow, measured pace of an executioner. In the front row, my mother-in-law, Susan Hanks, practically leaped out of her chair, her face contorted into a mask of ugly, unfiltered rage. "What is the meaning of this?" Susan hissed loudly, completely forgetting her country club manners. She pointed a shaking finger at me. "Sophia, you were explicitly disinvited. How on earth did you get past security, and where did you steal that suit?" "Gregory!" she yelled toward the back of the terrace. "Gregory, call the police and have my daughter-in-law removed this instant." Gregory, the general manager, was standing near the terrace exit. He simply crossed his arms. "Sit down, Mrs. Hanks," he said, his voice cold and devoid of any customer service polish. I ignored Susan entirely. I stepped up onto the raised wooden altar. The officiant, reading the absolute terror radiating from John, wisely stepped back and handed me his dead microphone. I didn't need it. My security team had already routed a wireless lapel mic I was wearing directly into the club's concert-grade sound system. "Good afternoon, everyone!" My voice boomed across the terrace, rich, steady, and amplified. The sheer authority in my tone forced the murmuring crowd into a dead silence. "I apologize for the abrupt interruption. I know many of you were expecting a fairy tale, but I deal in a reality." I looked out over the sea of confused, wealthy faces. For those of you who don't know me, my name is not just Sophia Hanks, the public school librarian, I said, my gaze sweeping across the front row. I am Sophia White. I am the chairwoman, CEO, and majority shareholder of White Holdings, the corporate entity that owns the Rosewood Coastal Club, the ground you are sitting on, and the air you are breathing. The reaction was instantaneous. A shockwave went through the elite crowd. These were venture capitalists and real estate moguls. They all knew the name White Holdings. It was a ghost empire, famously private and obscenely wealthy. To realize the chairwoman was standing in front of them, claiming to be the wife of a mid-level manager like John Hanks, was completely unfathomable. Susan Hanks collapsed back into her Chiavari chair as if she had been shot. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. I turned my attention to the bride's side of the altar. Richard Kensington was gripping his daughter's arm so tightly his knuckles were white. His arrogant posture had completely vanished, replaced by the cornered, desperate look of a trapped rat. "Mr. Kensington," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. Richard swallowed hard, a bead of sweat tracing down his temple. "Ms. White, Sophia, I don't understand. This is a private family event. We can discuss business on Monday." "We are not going to discuss business on Monday, Richard," I replied smoothly, stepping closer to him. "We are going to discuss it right now, because you invited half of the East Coast elite to this wedding to project an image of financial invulnerability. You wanted these politicians and hedge fund managers to think you were a king." I pulled a folded piece of heavy cardstock from my suit pocket, the bailout request he had signed. "4 days ago, you submitted a blind, desperate plea to my firm," I announced, projecting my voice so the politicians in the back row could hear every single syllable. "You begged White Holdings for a $15 million distressed asset buyout. You begged us to absorb your toxic debt because Kensington Commercial Real Estate isn't a legitimate firm anymore. It is a collapsing Ponzi scheme, and you have been illegally shuffling tenant escrow funds to cover your offshore losses." Chaos erupted in the audience. 2 hedge fund managers in the third row, men who had likely invested in Richard's funds, stood up immediately, their faces turning purple with rage. The illusion of the Kensington dynasty shattered into a million pieces right there on the manicured lawn. "You're lying!" Victoria shrieked, breaking her perfectly curated bridal posture. She lunged forward, pointing a manicured nail at my face. "My father is a titan. You're just John's pathetic, broke wife trying to ruin my day because you're jealous." "Victoria, shut up," Richard hissed, trying to pull her back, knowing exactly how much danger he was in. But the spoiled socialite wouldn't listen. No, Dad, do something, Victoria demanded, her voice shrill and hysterical. Have her arrested. She's ruining the aesthetic. I looked at Victoria, looking at the $2.5 million jade brooch pinned to her chest. A cold, predatory smile spread across my face. Arrested? I echoed, turning to the two plainclothes detectives standing at the bottom of the altar steps. That's a fantastic idea, Victoria. Let's talk about the police. Let's talk about exactly how you funded this little aesthetic of yours, because your father's Ponzi scheme is just the appetizer. What you did to your fiancé's mother, well, that's where the real felony begins. I turned my gaze toward Liam, who was standing completely frozen, staring at his bride like she was a stranger. Brace yourself, Liam, I said softly. You're about to find out exactly how much your bride's love costs. The wind off the Atlantic seemed to completely stop, as if the entire Rhode Island coast was holding its breath. 200 of the most powerful people on the eastern seaboard were dead silent, their eyes locked on the altar. I turned my attention to Liam. He was standing there in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, his hands trembling at his sides. He looked at me, then at Victoria, his face a portrait of absolute confusion and mounting dread. Liam, I began, my voice softening just a fraction, because unlike his brother, Liam wasn't malicious. He was just a mark. You have a spotless financial record. An 800 credit score, no debt. You thought you were bringing that stability into a marriage with a wealthy heiress, but Victoria didn't want your last name. She needed your social security number. Victoria let out a panicked, breathless gasp. She tried to step in front of Liam, grabbing his lapels. Liam, don't listen to her. She's crazy. She forged those documents to frame us. Harrison, standing perfectly straight at the bottom of the altar steps, didn't say a word. He simply unclasped his leather briefcase, pulled out a stack of notarized documents, and handed them to one of the Rhode Island financial crimes detectives. The detective stepped forward and held the papers up for the wedding party to see. 2 weeks ago, I continued, my voice echoing through the speakers, a high-interest home equity line of credit was approved by a predatory online lender. Nearly $400,000 was instantly wired into an offshore shell account belonging to Kensington Commercial Real Estate. It was a desperate cash injection to keep Richard's Ponzi scheme floating just long enough to get through this wedding. That has nothing to do with me, Liam stammered, his voice cracking. I never signed anything like that. I don't own a home. You don't, I agreed smoothly. I turned my gaze to the front row, locking eyes with my mother-in-law. Susan Hanks was clutching her pearls, her face pale and sweaty. Susan, you might want to sit down, I said coldly, because the collateral used for that $400,000 loan was your fully paid-off house in New Jersey. Susan let out a sound that was half gasp, half shriek. She leaped to her feet, knocking her crystal Chiavari chair backward onto the manicured grass. My house? No, the deed is in a safety deposit box. That's impossible. It's very possible when your future daughter-in-law steals your identity, I explained, gesturing toward Victoria, who was now physically backing away from Liam. Victoria forged your signature, Susan. She used Liam's pristine credit profile as a co-signer to bypass the manual underwriting process. The IP logs for the digital signatures traced directly back to Victoria's personal MacBook. I paused, letting the sheer weight of the betrayal sink into Susan's status-obsessed brain. You spent the last 7 years treating me like absolute garbage, Susan, I said, my tone laced with dark, poetic justice. You constantly bragged to your country club friends about how refined and elite Victoria was. You practically worshipped her, and she thanked you by secretly mortgaging your home to pay her father's criminal debts. By Monday morning, the bank was going to foreclose on your house. Susan looked at Victoria. The adoration in her eyes was completely gone, replaced by a violent, horrified realization. The girl she had championed as the ultimate prize had nearly rendered her homeless. Susan collapsed onto the grass, burying her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. At the altar, Liam finally snapped out of his trance. He looked at Victoria, the woman he was supposed to marry, in less than 10 minutes. The dopey, love-struck expression he had worn for years vanished, instantly replaced by a sudden, violent clarity. Baby, please, Victoria whispered, tears streaming down her perfectly contoured face. She reached out for his hands. I had to. My dad was going to lose everything. Once we were married, I was going to figure out a way to pay it back. I swear, I did it for us. Liam didn't scream. He didn't curse. He reached up to the lapel of his tuxedo and ripped off the white orchid boutonniere. It was a sharp, impulsive motion that sent petals scattering across the floor like shrapnel. "Don't you ever touch me again," Liam whispered. His voice wasn't amplified, but in the dead silence of the terrace, everyone heard it. He threw the ruined flower at her feet. He took 3 steps backward, wiping his hands on his trousers as if her touch had physically contaminated him. Then, without a single backward glance, Liam walked down the steps of the altar and pushed his way through the crowd, leaving his bride standing completely alone. Victoria was hyperventilating. The aesthetic was ruined. The elite guests were whispering, pulling out their phones, recording the spectacular collapse of the Kensington family. She looked around for support, but her father was slumped against the wooden archway, defeated. In a last desperate attempt to reclaim her superiority, Victoria turned her venom on me. "You think you've won?" she shrieked, her voice cracking wildly. She pointed at her chest, her fingers violently tapping the massive green jade brooch pinned to her Vera Wang gown. "You're just jealous. You'll never have what I have. Look at this. John bought me this. It's an antique. It's an heirloom. It screams old money, and it proves that I belong here, not you." I looked at the brooch. Then, very slowly, I turned my head and locked eyes with my husband. John was literally shaking. His teeth were chattering audibly. He looked like a man standing on the tracks, watching the freight train barrel right toward him. "Is that what you told her, John?" I asked, my voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly calm. "Did you tell her you found it at an exclusive estate sale in the Hamptons?" John couldn't speak. He just shook his head, tears of pure terror spilling down his cheeks. I turned back to the crowd, raising my voice to reach the back rows. "That brooch is indeed an antique. It is imperial green jade, carved in the late Qing dynasty, surrounded by a halo of flawless Cartier diamonds. It has a registered international serial number laser engraved on the platinum backing." I took a slow step toward Victoria, who was now clutching the brooch protectively. "It belonged to my grandmother, Eleanor White," I stated, the words hitting the crowd like a physical blow. "Its registered appraisal value is $2.5 million. And it was locked in a cedar box in my bedroom closet until my husband pried the lock open with a screwdriver and stole it to impress a family of broke, desperate fraudsters." The crowd erupted. $2.5 million. The sheer magnitude of the theft sent shockwaves through the elite guests. They weren't just witnessing a messy divorce, they were witnessing a major felony. "No!" Victoria screamed, backing away from me. "He gave it to me. It's a gift. You're lying." I didn't argue with her. I simply nodded to the 2 detectives waiting at the bottom of the stairs. "Officers," I said, my voice echoing over the speakers one last time. "I would like to officially report a grand larceny, and I believe the stolen property is currently pinned to the suspect's dress." The 2 detectives didn't hesitate. They marched up the wooden steps of the altar, their faces set in stone, handcuffs already gleaming in the winter sun. The final act of the Rosewood Coastal Club massacre had officially begun. The 2 plainclothes detectives, men with the hardened, no-nonsense demeanor typical of the Rhode Island Financial Crimes Unit, marched up the wooden steps of the altar. The winter sun glinted off the badges clipped to their belts. "Ma'am, step back." The lead detective, a tall, broad-shouldered man named Hayes, instructed Victoria, "Do not attempt to remove the item yourself." Victoria shrank back, her eyes wide and wild like a cornered animal. She clutched the jade brooch with both hands, her manicured acrylic nails digging into the flawless Cartier diamonds. "Don't touch me," she shrieked, her voice cracking into an ugly, guttural sob. "This is mine. It's my wedding day. You can't do this. My father knows the governor." Detective Hayes didn't even blink. He had dealt with entitled, hysterical rich kids his entire career. He stepped firmly into her personal space. "Victoria Kensington, if you do not release the stolen property right now, I will add resisting arrest and obstruction of justice to your federal wire fraud charges. Let it go." Richard Kensington, standing paralyzed a few feet away, finally found his voice. "Victoria, for God's sake, give it to them," he croaked, looking at the second detective who was currently pulling a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. Whimpering, her chest heaving in her custom Vera Wang gown, Victoria slowly lowered her hands. Detective Hayes reached out with gloved fingers and expertly unclasped the heavy platinum pin from the silk of her bodice. The fabric snagged, tearing slightly with a sharp rip that sounded incredibly loud in the dead silence of the terrace. He dropped the $2.5 million imperial green jade heirloom, the physical embodiment of my grandmother's legacy and Victoria's fake aristocratic aesthetic, into a cheap, clear plastic evidence bag. The contrast was absolutely poetic. With the brooch gone, Victoria looked completely hollowed out. She wasn't an East Coast heiress anymore. She was just a broke, 26-year-old fraud standing in a torn dress surrounded by white orchids and impending federal indictments. But as satisfying as it was to watch Victoria's delusion shatter, she was only the collateral damage. The main event was standing right next to her. I turned my gaze to John. My husband was swaying on his feet. The arrogant, slick-talking regional sales manager who had spent the last 7 years treating me like a pathetic burden was entirely gone. His expensive Tom Ford cologne couldn't mask the sour, pungent smell of raw panic radiating off his body. He looked at the evidence bag in the detective's hand, and the reality of his situation finally crashed through his thick skull. Grand larceny in the first degree. Interstate transport of stolen property. Forgery. He wasn't looking at a slap on the wrist or a messy divorce settlement. He was looking at a decade in a federal penitentiary. John's knees gave out. He collapsed onto the altar, his tailored tuxedo trousers soaking up the moisture from the crushed white rose petals. He didn't care about the elite guests watching him. He didn't care about his mother, Susan, who was still wailing on the grass in the front row. He crawled toward me on his hands and knees, scrambling over the wooden floorboards like a beggar. "Soph, baby, please," John sobbed, tears and snot freely streaming down his face, completely ruining his perfectly moisturized skin. He reached out, desperately trying to grab the hem of my trousers, but my security chief stepped in, kicking John's hand away with a heavy steel-toed boot. John recoiled, but kept begging, looking up at me with terrified, bloodshot eyes. "Sophia, you have to listen to me. I didn't know how much it was worth. I swear to God, I just thought it was some old thing you picked up at a thrift store. Victoria and Richard, they were pressuring me. They made me feel like I was nothing. I just wanted a heritage piece to prove I was good enough for them. I did it for us, Soph. I was trying to network to build our future." I looked down at the pathetic, sniveling man crying at my feet. "You didn't do it for us, John," I said, my voice as cold and unforgiving as the Atlantic Ocean crashing against the cliffs below. "You did it for you. You broke into my locked cedar box. You pried it open with a screwdriver. You took my grandmother's legacy to Bartholomew and Company in Manhattan, and you tried to permanently deface it with a laser engraver just to score cheap points with a 26-year-old grifter." John gasped, his eyes widening in sheer horror. He hadn't realized I knew about the jeweler. He hadn't realized I had mapped out every single one of his sins. "You spent our entire marriage trying to run with the big dogs," I whispered, leaning down just slightly so only he could hear the absolute finality in my voice. "Well, congratulations, John. You finally made it into the elite circle. Unfortunately for you, this particular circle doesn't tolerate thieves." I stood up straight and gave a sharp nod to the second detective. "John Hanks," the detective barked, stepping forward and hauling my husband up by the collar of his ruined tuxedo jacket. "You are under arrest for grand larceny in the first degree." The metallic click of the handcuffs snapping shut around John's wrist echoed across the terrace. It was the most beautiful piece of music I had heard all day. "You have the right to remain silent," the detective continued, spinning John around and marching him toward the terrace exit. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." "Sophia, please, don't let them take me. Call Harrison." "Tell him to fix this," John screamed over his shoulder, his voice cracking into a hysterical pitch as he was dragged down the center aisle. The elite guests, the politicians, the hedge fund managers, the very people John had sacrificed his marriage and his freedom to impress, didn't offer him a shred of pity. High society is a ruthless ecosystem. When you smell like blood, they don't help you. They step over you. I watched as a prominent venture capitalist physically pulled his wife out of the way, looking at John with an expression of unfiltered disgust, as if my husband were a rabid stray dog being hauled to the pound. As John was dragged away, another team of officers moved in on the Kensington side of the altar. "Richard Kensington, Victoria Kensington," a stern-faced federal agent announced, flashing a badge. "We have a warrant for your arrest regarding federal wire fraud, identity theft, and the illegal transfer of escrow funds. Put your hands where I can see them." Victoria let out an ear-piercing scream, thrashing wildly as an officer grabbed her arm. Richard, however, didn't fight. The fake real estate titan simply hung his head, holding his wrists out in quiet, absolute defeat. The Ponzi scheme was over. Down in the grass, Susan Hanks was rocking back and forth, clutching her chest. She was watching her golden boy son being stuffed into the back of a Newport police cruiser, knowing that the bank was simultaneously foreclosing on her heavily mortgaged home. She looked up at me, her eyes completely shattered. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply reached up to my lapel, unclipped the wireless microphone, and dropped it onto the wooden floorboards of the altar. I turned my back on the screaming bride, the crying mother-in-law, and the ruined, trampled white orchids. I walked down the side steps of the terrace, moving with the quiet, untouchable grace of a woman who had just successfully executed a flawless corporate takeover. Harrison fell into step right beside me. "The helicopter is prepped and waiting on the roof, Ms. White, and the legal filings for the divorce and the civil suits have already been stamped by the clerk." "Excellent," I said, buttoning my midnight blue suit jacket against the biting winter wind. "Let them enjoy their weekend in a holding cell. I'll see John in court." By Monday morning, January 26, 2026, the media circus had officially descended. The financial press and the high society tabloids don't normally cross paths, but the spectacular implosion at the Rosewood Coastal Club was the perfect storm of white-collar crime and East Coast aristocratic scandal. Page 6 ran a sprawling exposé titled "The Fake Heiress and the Ponzi Patriarch," featuring a blurry, zoomed-in cell phone photo of Victoria Kensington screaming in her torn Vera Wang gown as she was shoved into the back of a Newport police cruiser. The Wall Street Journal took a drier, much more devastating approach, detailing the exact mechanics of Richard Kensington's fraudulent empire and the offshore shell accounts that had just been frozen by the SEC. I sat at the head of the obsidian table in my Manhattan boardroom, sipping a cup of Earl Grey tea, watching the news coverage play out on the massive wall monitors on mute. For 7 years, I had kept my name entirely out of the press. White Holdings was a ghost ship by design, but now the media was absolutely eating out of the palm of my hand. My PR team had expertly steered the narrative. I was the elusive, brilliant billionaire chairwoman who had personally uncovered a massive fraud ring infiltrating her properties. Harrison walked into the boardroom carrying a fresh stack of legal dossiers. He looked rested, carrying a quiet, lethal energy. "Good morning, Ms. White," Harrison said, taking his seat. "The fallout is proceeding exactly as modeled. Richard Kensington was denied bail. Given the flight risk and the sheer volume of the defrauded investors coming out of the woodwork, the federal judge remanded him directly to federal custody." "And the bride?" I asked, taking a sip of my tea. "Victoria made bail late last night," Harrison replied, a faint smirk crossing his face. "Though bail is a loose term. Her personal accounts were seized, so she had to use a predatory bail bondsman. She's currently confined to the state of New York, wearing an ankle monitor and facing multiple counts of identity theft and accessory to wire fraud." I nodded. It was exactly what she deserved. She had played a dangerous, reckless game with people's lives to maintain an aesthetic, and now her aesthetic was a heavy GPS tracker strapped to her leg. "What about my soon-to-be ex-husband?" I asked, setting my teacup down. Harrison opened a blue folder. "John Hanks spent the entire weekend in a county holding cell. His credit cards are maxed out, and since you completely froze your joint checking account on Saturday morning, he didn't have a single dollar to post his own bail. He had to wait until his public defender could arrange a bond agreement this morning." I almost laughed. John, the man who obsessed over custom Tom Ford suits and Italian leather, had spent 3 nights sleeping on a concrete slab next to a stainless steel toilet. "There's more," Harrison continued, sliding a corporate letterhead across the table. "I took the liberty of having a polite, off-the-record conversation with the HR director at John's consulting firm first thing this morning. When they saw the viral footage of their regional sales manager being arrested for grand larceny in the first degree at a highly publicized society event, they went into full panic mode." I picked up the letter. It was a formal notice of termination. "Fired for cause," Harrison stated, "effective immediately. Gross misconduct and bringing public disrepute to the company." They didn't even give him a severance package. They boxed up his desk and mailed it to his brother's apartment. The final nail in his professional coffin. John had completely tied his self-worth to his fake corporate persona. He had belittled my job as a librarian, bragging about his inevitable promotion to VP. Now he was an unemployed felon with an $84,000 mountain of high-interest credit card debt waiting for him and absolutely zero income to service it. "Has he tried to contact me?" I asked. Harrison tapped his iPad. "He has left 14 voicemails on your old encrypted phone number, and he attempted to call this office twice. Security blocked the calls. He is entirely iced out, Sophia. The only communication he will receive from us will be through the divorce filings. Keep it that way, I instructed. I don't want to hear his voice until we are sitting in the mediation room. I stood up and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the financial district below. The city was moving at a frantic pace, millions of people chasing a dollar, chasing status, chasing a lie. Harrison, I said, turning back to him, what is the status of Susan Hanks? Harrison let out a heavy sigh, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. If there was one aspect of this entire operation that was undeniably brutal, it was the collateral damage inflicted upon my mother-in-law. It's done, Harrison said quietly. When the feds froze Kensington Commercial Real Estate's assets, the online lender that Victoria used to take out that fraudulent HELOC panicked. Because the loan was secured by Susan's house in New Jersey and the primary borrower, Victoria, is now under federal indictment for forging the documents, the bank moved to mitigate their losses immediately. Foreclosure, I murmured. Fast-tracked, Harrison confirmed. Susan received the official notice to vacate yesterday afternoon. Liam called me, completely frantic, asking if there was any legal loophole to save it. I had to tell him the truth, because Susan technically handed Victoria her personal identifying information months ago to help with wedding planning. The bank is arguing gross negligence on Susan's part. The house is gone, Sophia. It hits the auction block in 30 days. I felt a brief, fleeting moment of pity, but it vanished as quickly as it came. I remembered the countless dinners where Susan had deliberately seated me at the far end of the table. I remembered her accidentally spilling red wine on a dress I had saved up for months to buy, simply because she thought it looked cheap. I remembered her standing on that country club lawn, screaming at me to be arrested just moments before she found out her precious elite daughter-in-law had stolen the roof over her head. Karma wasn't just a concept, it was a highly efficient accounting system. Where is she staying? I asked. Liam rented a U-Haul yesterday, Harrison replied. He moved her out of the 4-bedroom suburban estate and into his tiny 1-bedroom apartment in Hoboken. She is reportedly beside herself. She tried reaching out to her country club friends for a bridge loan, but she's a pariah. I finished the sentence for him. The East Coast elite don't lend money to the mother of an arrested felon who just got scammed out of her own home. It's bad for their brand. I walked back to the table and closed the legal dossiers. The board was set. The opposition had been utterly decimated by their own greed. They had chased the illusion of wealth right off the edge of a cliff. Draft the final divorce settlement, Harrison, I ordered, my voice ringing with absolute finality. Schedule the mediation for February 20th. Give John 3 weeks to truly feel the weight of his poverty. Give him 3 weeks of dodging debt collectors, eating cheap ramen, and realizing exactly what he threw away. I looked at the blazing New York skyline. When we walk into that mediation room, I whispered, I want him completely broken. The next 3 weeks were a masterclass in the absolute systematic destruction of a man's ego. If you ever want to see how quickly a self-proclaimed alpha male crumbles when you take away his credit limit, look no further than John Hanks. According to the private investigators Harrison kept on retainer, John's transition from a high-rolling executive to a desperate couch-surfing pariah took exactly 4 days. With his bank accounts completely frozen and his leased BMW officially repossessed from a long-term parking lot in Queens, John had nowhere to go. He was forced to move into his younger brother Liam's cramped 1-bedroom apartment in Hoboken, New Jersey. The living situation was, by all accounts, a toxic wasteland of misplaced blame and absolute misery. Liam, the human golden retriever who had his heart and his credit score simultaneously ripped to shreds by Victoria Kensington, was working double shifts at his architecture firm just to keep the lights on. He was sleeping on a cheap air mattress in the living room. John was relegated to the lumpy, heavily stained sofa. And then there was Susan, my former mother-in-law, the woman who used to boast about her exclusive country club luncheons, was now crammed into Liam's tiny guest alcove, surrounded by garbage bags full of whatever clothes she could grab before the bank officially padlocked her sprawling suburban estate. According to Liam, who had actually called my office to tearfully apologize for everything his family had put me through, the apartment smelled like cheap takeout and resentment. John spent his days frantically refreshing his email, applying to every mid-level sales job on the East Coast. But the internet is written in ink. The moment a recruiter Googled John Hanks, the top results were HD videos of him being dragged out of the Rosewood Coastal Club in handcuffs, followed closely by the Wall Street Journal's breakdown of the Kensington Ponzi scheme. He was entirely radioactive. His network of VP buddies and frat brothers? They ghosted him faster than a bad Tinder date. They blocked his number, ignored his LinkedIn messages, and pretended they had never met him. By the second week of February, the reality of his poverty finally set in. Without the thousands of dollars I had been secretly funneling into our joint account every month, John couldn't even afford to buy a decent cup of coffee. He was eating generic brand cereal and avoiding calls from aggressively persistent debt collectors who were hunting him down for the $84,000 in unsecured credit card debt. He was drowning, and there was no one left to throw him a life preserver. Which brought us to Friday, February 20th, 2026, the morning of the final divorce mediation. I woke up in my residential wing at the top of the White Holdings Tower. I didn't feel a single ounce of anxiety. I felt light. I felt like I had spent 7 years carrying a 100-pound weight on my chest, and someone had finally cut the straps. I took my time getting ready. I chose a pristine, tailored white Alexander McQueen pantsuit. It was crisp, aggressive, and undeniably powerful. I paired it with a sleek chignon and a pair of vintage Cartier diamond earrings. It wasn't just an outfit, it was a psychological weapon. I wanted John to look across the table and physically see the billion-dollar empire he had thrown away for a fake socialite. At 9:45 a.m., my security detail escorted me down to Harrison's law firm, located in a sprawling, glass-walled office in Midtown Manhattan. The mediation room was intimidating by design, a long slab of cold white marble surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park. Harrison was already there, organizing a pristine stack of legal documents. "Good morning, Ms. White," Harrison said, offering a rare, genuine smile. "Are we ready to put the nail in the coffin?" "Hand me the hammer," I replied, taking my seat at the head of the table. At exactly 10 a.m., the heavy glass doors swung open. John walked in, and for a split second, my breath caught in my throat. Not out of residual love, but out of pure shock at his physical deterioration. The man who walked into that room was a ghost of the arrogant, slick-talking executive I had married. He had lost at least 15 pounds in 3 weeks. His cheekbones were hollow, and his eyes were rimmed with dark, exhausted bags. He was wearing an off-the-rack, cheap gray suit that hung loosely on his shrinking frame, a far cry from the custom Tom Ford tuxedos he used to charge to his Amex. But what truly made the scene pathetic was the man walking in next to him. John couldn't afford a real defense attorney. He certainly couldn't afford a high-powered divorce lawyer. So he had scraped the bottom of the barrel and found a sleazy, desperate ambulance chaser named Miller, no relation to my brilliant accountant. This cut-rate lawyer had clearly taken John's case on contingency, salivating at the thought of getting a percentage of a billionaire's divorce settlement. John sat down across from me. He didn't look me in the eye. He stared at the marble table, his hands trembling slightly as he clasped them together. His lawyer, however, puffed out his chest and threw a poorly organized manila folder onto the table. "All right, let's cut the pleasantries," the lawyer sneered, leaning forward with the unearned confidence of a man who thought he held a winning lottery ticket. "We know exactly how much your client is worth, Mr. Harrison. We've seen the White Holdings portfolio. New York is an equitable distribution state. My client supported his wife for 7 years. He provided the marital home. He paid the rent. We are prepared to walk away quietly today without dragging this into a messy public trial for a lump sum alimony payment of $10 million, plus having Ms. White drop the criminal theft charges regarding the jade brooch." I didn't blink. I didn't react. I just slowly turned my head and looked at Harrison. Harrison let out a soft, almost pitying chuckle. He adjusted his glasses and looked at John's lawyer like he was a toddler who had wandered into a boardroom. $10 million, Harrison repeated, the words dripping with absolute condescension. "That is a fascinating number. Tell me, counselor, before you decided to take this case on contingency and embarrass yourself in my office, did you bother to ask your client if he had signed any legally binding documents prior to his marriage?" The sleazy lawyer frowned, glancing sideways at John. "What are you talking about? My client said there was no prenup. He said she was a broke librarian when they got married." John flinched, shrinking down into his cheap suit. She was, he stammered, his voice raspy and weak. "She hid the money. That's financial fraud. The judge will throw it out." Harrison didn't argue. He simply reached into his briefcase, pulled out the original yellowed copy of our prenuptial agreement and slid it across the cold marble table. It stopped directly in front of John. "Read it, John," I said softly, leaning forward. "Read the document you forced me to sign because you were terrified I was going to steal your entry-level 401k. John stared at the paper as if it were a venomous snake. His lawyer snatched it up, his eyes aggressively scanning the legal jargon. "Article 4, Section 2, Harrison recited perfectly from memory, leaning back in his leather chair. "Any and all assets acquired prior to the marriage or acquired via inheritance, trust, or gift shall remain the sole and separate property of the original owner. Neither party shall have any claim to the other's separate estate, regardless of the duration of the union. It is an ironclad, total separation of assets." The blood completely drained from the sleazy lawyer's face. He realized, in real time, that he had wasted 3 weeks representing a broke felon for absolutely zero payout. "You..." the lawyer stammered, turning to John with a look of pure disgust. "You drafted this? You brought this to a notary? I didn't know." John practically screamed, his voice cracking into a hysterical pitch. He slammed his fists on the table, glaring at me with a mixture of hatred and absolute desperation. "She lied to me. She played me for 7 years. This is a setup." "The only person who played you, John, was you," I said, my voice slicing through his tantrum with surgical precision. "You were so obsessed with protecting your pathetic little pile of money that you built a fortress to keep me out. You legally guaranteed that what was yours stayed yours, and what was mine stayed mine." I leaned in, resting my elbows on the marble, locking eyes with the man who had destroyed his own life. "So here is how equitable distribution is going to work today," I whispered, delivering the final, crushing blow. "I am keeping my billion-dollar real estate empire, and you get to keep exactly what you brought into this marriage. Your massive credit card debt, your pending federal felony charges, and your absolute, undeniably worthless pride." The silence in the Midtown mediation room was so absolute, you could hear the faint hum of the climate control system. John's sleazy contingency fee lawyer stared at the yellowed prenuptial agreement for another 10 seconds, his eyes darting back and forth across the legal text, desperately searching for a loophole that simply didn't exist. He had bet his entire month's paycheck on squeezing a multi-million-dollar settlement out of a billionaire, only to find out his client had legally locked himself in a financial burning building 7 years ago. The lawyer violently snapped his manila folder shut. The sharp thwack made John jump in his cheap gray suit. "You've got to be kidding me," the lawyer spat, his face flushing dark red. He didn't look at me or Harrison. He glared entirely at John. "You told me you supported her. You told me this was a slam-dunk, equitable distribution case. You didn't mention you signed an ironclad, total separation of assets drafted by a cut-rate notary in Queens." I didn't know she was rich," John pleaded, his voice cracking, panic fully setting in. "You have to fight this. Tell them it was signed under false pretenses." "I'm not fighting a billionaire's legal team over a document you voluntarily signed to protect your own ego, Hanks," the lawyer snarled, stuffing the folder into his battered leather briefcase. "I work on contingency. 30% of zero is zero. You're completely broke. You're facing federal time, and I am not running a charity." The lawyer stood up, aggressively pushing his chair back. He looked at Harrison and gave a stiff, embarrassed nod. "Mr. Harrison, Miss White, my apologies for wasting your morning. I am officially withdrawing as Mr. Hanks's counsel, effective immediately." "Wait! You can't just leave me here," John shouted, lunging forward and grabbing the lawyer's sleeve. The lawyer ripped his arm away with a look of pure, unfiltered disgust. "Watch me. Good luck with the public defender, John." The heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung open and clicked shut. John's lawyer practically sprinted to the elevator, leaving my husband entirely alone on his side of the cold white marble table. John stared at the empty chair next to him, his breathing shallow and rapid. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was suspended in mid-air, waiting for gravity to pull him down into the abyss. He slowly turned his head to look at me. The arrogant swagger, the meticulously curated VP persona, the condescending smirks, they were all gone. All that was left was a hollow, terrified shell of a man. "Sophia," he whispered, his voice trembling so violently he could barely form the syllables. "Please, I'm your husband. We spent 7 years together, 7 years. You can't just leave me with nothing. I'll go to prison." They're going to put me in a federal cell for stealing that brooch. You have the power to stop this. Just drop the charges. Give me enough to pay off the credit cards so I can start over." I sat perfectly still in my tailored white Alexander McQueen suit. I didn't feel a shred of empathy. I didn't feel a sliver of regret. "We didn't spend 7 years together, John," I said, my voice eerily calm, devoid of any emotional warmth. "You spent 7 years standing in front of a mirror, admiring your own reflection, while I stood in the background and quietly paid the electricity bill so you could keep the lights on." He flinched, a tear finally spilling over his lower lid and dropping onto the polished marble. "I gave you every single opportunity to be a partner," I continued, leaning forward slightly. "I hid my wealth because I wanted to see who you were when there was no safety net, and you showed me. You showed me that you were willing to steal from your own wife. You showed me that you were willing to permanently deface my grandmother's legacy just to buy a fleeting moment of validation from a family of criminals who thought you were a joke." I nodded to Harrison. Harrison silently slid a thick stack of legal documents across the table. On top was the final divorce decree. Next to it was a sleek, heavy Mont Blanc pen. "Sign the papers, John," Harrison ordered, his tone flat and uncompromising. "You are walking away with your $84,000 in credit card debt, and you are assuming all legal liabilities for your pending grand larceny trial. If you refuse to sign, we will tie you up in civil litigation for the next decade. We will garnish whatever minimum wage wages you manage to earn when you get out of prison. Sign it now, and Ms. White will simply let the criminal justice system handle you." John looked at the pen. He looked at the paperwork. His hands were shaking so badly he had to grip his right wrist with his left hand just to pick the pen up. He didn't argue. He had no leverage, no money, and no allies left in the world. With a ragged, pathetic sob, John pressed the pen to the paper. The ink flowed across the signature line, officially terminating the greatest financial and social safety net he had ever stumbled into. His tears dripped onto the heavy cardstock, blurring the fresh ink. He slid the papers back across the table, completely defeated. "Get out," I said quietly. He didn't look at me again. He pushed his chair back, the legs scraping loudly against the floor, and shuffled out of the boardroom. He walked with a heavy, broken gait, his shoulders slumped, heading back out into a city that was going to chew him up and spit him out. While John was signing his life away in Midtown, the architect of his brother's misery was facing her own brutal reality check down in Soho. Victoria Kensington was standing at the glass counter of a high-end luxury consignment shop. A month ago, she would have sneered at this place, calling it a graveyard for the desperate. Today, she was the corpse. She wasn't wearing Vera Wang. She was wearing a pair of oversized sunglasses to hide her face, a black trench coat, and the heavy, bulky outline of a police-issued GPS ankle monitor strapped firmly above her left boot. The bell on the boutique door chimed as she nervously shifted her weight. She placed a pristine, bright orange Hermes Birkin bag onto the glass counter. It was the last remnant of the aristocratic life she thought she was entitled to. The clerk, a sharp-eyed girl in her 20s whom Victoria had once rudely dismissed at a Hamptons brunch 2 years prior, looked over the bag with agonizing, deliberate slowness. The clerk picked it up, checking the stitching, the hardware, and the serial number stamp, thoroughly savoring the massive shift in their power dynamic. "The offer is $3,000 flat," the clerk said, not bothering to look up. Victoria pulled her sunglasses down her nose, her eyes flashing with a desperate dying ember of her old arrogance. $3,000? Are you insane? That is a $30,000 bag. It's an exclusive colorway. It's practically a collector's item. "It's a buyer's market," the clerk shrugged, dropping the bag back onto the counter with a heavy thud. "And frankly, nobody in this zip code wants to be seen carrying an accessory associated with the Kensington name right now. It's bad for their personal brand. Not to mention, half your father's assets are being seized by the feds to pay back his Ponzi victims. People are assuming anything you own was bought with stolen money." Victoria's jaw tightened. She wanted to scream. She wanted to demand to see the manager. She wanted to threaten to destroy the store's reputation on her Instagram. But her Instagram had been deleted. Her father was sitting in a federal holding facility. Her fiancé had annulled their marriage before the ink was even dry on the license. And she owed a predatory bail bondsman $5,000 by the end of the week, or she was going straight to Rikers Island. She looked at the clerk, the fight completely draining out of her. "Fine," Victoria whispered, her voice cracking, her pride shattering into a million pieces right there on the shop floor. "I'll take the $3,000. She took the check, pulled her collar up to hide her face from the paparazzi she paranoidly thought were following her, and walked out into the freezing New York rain. A complete pariah, entirely isolated in the city she once thought she ruled. Across the Hudson River, the fallout was significantly less fashionable, but infinitely more brutal. Susan Hanks, the woman who had spent the last 7 years treating me like a second-class citizen, was currently sitting on the edge of a deflating air mattress in a cramped one-bedroom apartment in Hoboken, New Jersey. The air in the tiny unit smelled of damp drywall and the cheap boxed macaroni and cheese Liam had made for dinner the night before. Outside the single, grime-streaked window, the relentless noise of a garbage truck grinding its gears echoed through the alleyway. It was a far cry from the manicured, whisper-quiet cul-de-sacs of her former suburban estate. Susan stared blankly at her cracked iPhone screen. She was scrolling through old photos of her colonial-style home, the sprawling kitchen island, the vaulted ceilings, the blooming hydrangeas she used to brag about at her exclusive country club luncheons. It was all completely gone. Sold in a bank-ordered fire sale to cover the $400,000 fraudulent HELOC Victoria Kensington had taken out in Liam's name. The bank hadn't cared that Susan was a victim of identity theft. They only cared that she had willingly handed over her social security number and financial documents to Victoria, blindingly trusting a 26-year-old grifter simply because she carried a designer handbag and had a wealthy last name. Gross negligence, the lawyers had called it. Susan had tried reaching out to her country club friends for a bridge loan or even just a place to stay for a few weeks. The rejections had been swift and devastating. The women she used to play tennis with didn't just decline, they actively blocked her number. In their elite, ruthless circles, the Hanks family wasn't just broke, they were socially radioactive. The front door of the apartment rattled and pushed open. John walked in, bringing a gust of freezing February air with him. He had just taken the PATH train back from Midtown Manhattan after signing the divorce papers. He looked like a walking corpse. He didn't take off his cheap gray suit jacket. He just kicked the door shut, walked over to the sagging, stained sofa, and collapsed face first into the cushions. Susan looked up from her phone, her eyes red and swollen. "Well?" she rasped, her voice completely devoid of its usual aristocratic arrogance. "What happened at the mediation, John? Did her lawyers offer a settlement? Are they going to pay off your credit cards?" John didn't lift his head. He just let out a hollow, suffocated sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "There is no settlement, Mom," John whispered into the upholstery. "There is no alimony. There is no payout. She kept everything." Susan's breath hitched. But you were married for 7 years. New York is an equitable distribution state. You provided for her. You paid the rent." John finally pushed himself up, his bloodshot eyes locking onto his mother. The sheer toxicity of their shared delusion had finally poisoned them both. "I didn't provide anything," John shouted, his voice cracking violently. "She paid for everything. She subsidized my entire life. And you know that prenup you told me to force her to sign? The one you said we needed to protect my 401k from her ghetto background? It held up. It locked me out of a billion-dollar trust fund. I am walking away with $84,000 in debt and a federal grand larceny trial." Susan stared at her son, the golden boy she had placed on an impossible pedestal. In a twist of absolute agonizing irony, Susan realized the horrifying truth. She had spent 7 years relentlessly bullying, belittling, and mocking a billionaire who could have bought her 10 estates without blinking. She had sneered at my clearance rack cardigans, completely unaware they were worn by a woman who owned the very ground she walked on. And instead, she had worshipped Victoria, a fraud who had literally stolen the roof over her head. The cycle of karma hadn't just turned, it had crushed them into dust. While the Hanks family was choking on the ashes of their own arrogance, I was breathing the rarest air in Manhattan. The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling glass walls of the White Holdings corporate headquarters, illuminating the dust motes dancing above the massive mahogany conference table. I stood at the head of the room, a sleek laser pointer in my hand, commanding the absolute, undivided attention of 50 of the most powerful shareholders, board members, and real estate partners on the East Coast. Gone were the wool coats and the apologetic posture. Today, I wore a tailored, cream-colored Tom Ford power suit that accentuated my authority, my hair pulled back in a sleek, uncompromising bun. "The quarterly projections," I said, my voice steady, amplified by the perfect acoustics of the boardroom, indicate a robust 18% increase in revenue following our recent acquisition of several distressed commercial assets, including the former Kensington portfolio. A low murmur of approval rippled through the room. Furthermore, I continued, clicking to the next slide, which showed a steep, aggressive upward trend in our stock valuation. The recent public restructuring at our Rosewood Coastal Club property has ironically only increased our brand visibility. The market loves absolute accountability. Bookings at our ultra luxe properties have tripled since January. We are no longer just a real estate trust. We are a symbol of invulnerability. I clicked the projector off, bringing the lights back up. Any questions? The room remained entirely silent. 6 months ago, some of these older Wall Street veterans might have tried to interrupt me. They might have tried to mansplain the market to a 34-year-old black woman who had inherited her grandmother's empire. Now they simply nodded, scribbling notes with a reverence usually reserved for royalty. They had all read the Wall Street Journal. They all knew exactly how surgically I had dismantled Richard Kensington and my own husband. I hadn't just inherited a company, I had earned their absolute terrifying respect. I closed my leather portfolio, dismissing the board meeting with a sharp nod. As the room emptied, filled with the shuffling of papers and hushed murmurs of approval, one man remained seated at the far end of the table. Alexander Sterling, the CEO of Sterling Hospitality, our largest and most aggressive corporate competitor. Alexander was a shark in a charcoal bespoke suit, a man infamous for hostile takeovers and ruthless negotiation tactics. He stood up slowly and walked toward me, not with the predatory, fake swagger of a man like John, but with the measured, careful pace of a lion approaching another lion. "That was a deeply impressive presentation, Sophia," Alexander said, his voice deep and textured. He stopped a respectful distance away. "I have to admit, when I heard Eleanor's granddaughter was fully taking the helm of White Holdings, I prepared a massive bid to aggressively buy you out. I thought you would be overwhelmed. I thought you would be soft." I crossed my arms, leaning slightly against the edge of the mahogany table, meeting his gaze head on. "And now?" Alexander smiled, a genuine expression of profound respect that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Now, I'm terrified." He let out a low chuckle. "You didn't just survive a scandal that would have tanked most CEOs. You weaponized it. You possess a ruthlessness that Eleanor would have been incredibly proud of." He reached into his jacket pocket, but instead of a business card, he pulled out a simple, understated reservation slip. "I'm not here to attempt a buyout, Sophia," Alexander said smoothly. "I'm here to learn. I have a private table at Le Bernardin tonight at 8. I would like to buy you dinner. Not to discuss a merger, and certainly not because I think you need my help. I want to pick your brain about the upcoming Asian market expansion." I looked at him. There was no condescension in his eyes. There was no desire to control, diminish, or manipulate me for my status. He was looking at me as an equal, a peer who had fought her way to the exact same table. It was the first time in a very long time a man had looked at me without seeing a dollar sign or a target. I checked the vintage Cartier watch on my wrist, calculated the optics, and made a decision. "I will be there, Alexander," I said, picking up my files. "But we split the bill. I don't let anyone pay for my time anymore." He laughed, a rich, booming sound of absolute approval. "I wouldn't dream of it, Ms. White." I watched Alexander Sterling walk out of the boardroom, his measured, confident stride matching my own internal rhythm. For the first time in 7 years, I wasn't bracing myself for a condescending remark or a frantic demand for money. I turned away from the heavy oak doors and walked toward the private executive elevator. The ride to the observation deck of the White Holdings Tower took exactly 45 seconds. In that short span of time, I rose 1,000 feet above the chaotic, grinding noise of the Manhattan streets. The glass doors slid open with a soft, melodic chime, revealing the sprawling rooftop terrace. It was the evening of February 20th, 2026. The winter air was crisp and biting, whipping around the structural glass balustrades, but I didn't shiver in my tailored McQueen suit. I walked to the edge and looked out at the glittering grid of the city. From up here, the yellow taxicabs looked like a slow-moving river of light, and the pedestrians were nothing more than tiny, insignificant specks scurrying through a concrete maze. It was a view that stripped away the noise. It was a view that told you exactly who you were. For 7 years, I had purposefully lived down there among the noise. I had made myself incredibly small to fit comfortably inside John's fragile, manufactured world. I had worn faded, clearance rack cardigans to soothe his financial insecurity. I had silenced my own boardroom-honed voice so he could feel like the loudest, most important person in our cramped Queens apartment. I had played the role of the frugal librarian, the invisible woman, the supportive anchor. I thought that if I just loved him enough, if I gave him enough of my light and quietly subsidized his life, he would eventually learn to shine on his own. I was wrong. Some people are not black holes because they are empty. They are black holes because they are insatiably hungry. They consume everything around them, your dignity, your money, your love, your peace of mind, and they never, ever give anything back. John, Victoria, Richard, Susan. They were all entirely the same. They believed that power was something you stole, something you married into, something you forged on a bank document or displayed on the lapel of a designer gown. They chased the shallow, hollow appearance of wealth while rotting from the inside out. Down in the city below me, the consequences of their rot were playing out in real time. John Hanks, the man who used to spend 2 hours steaming his silk pocket squares and lecturing me about executive networking, was currently working the night shift at a big box hardware store in New Jersey. He wore a stiff, scratchy polyester vest, scanning barcodes under harsh fluorescent lights to pay the minimum monthly interest on his $84,000 of credit card debt. He was entirely alone, awaiting his criminal trial for grand larceny with a notoriously overworked public defender. His mother, Susan, was living out of suitcases in Liam's living room, forced to take a part-time job as a receptionist at a local dental clinic just to afford groceries. The country club women she used to desperately impress now actively crossed the street to avoid her. Victoria Kensington's aristocratic aesthetic had been permanently traded for a heavy, unremovable GPS ankle monitor. She was doing court-ordered community service, scrubbing graffiti off brick walls in Brooklyn while awaiting her federal wire fraud trial, constantly pulling her hood up to hide her face from the paparazzi who occasionally drove by just to mock the fake heiress. And Richard Kensington was sitting in a federal holding facility, trading his tailored bespoke suits for a standard issue orange jumpsuit, his entire real estate empire liquidated to pay back the investors he had ruthlessly scammed. Only Liam had managed to escape the wreckage intact. He had called me one last time, not to ask for money or favors, but simply to thank me for opening his eyes before he legally tied his life to a sociopath. He was in therapy, focusing on his architecture career, completely cutting ties with the toxic ambition of his mother and brother. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the rarefied, freezing air of the summit. A part of me, the old Sophia, the woman who had desperately wanted a normal, simple life, might have felt a twinge of pity for them, but the 34-year-old billionaire standing on this roof felt only the cool, absolute detachment of justice served. They had tried to bury me beneath their arrogance, completely forgetting that I was a seed. I pressed my hand against the cold structural glass, seeing my own reflection superimposed over the blazing New York skyline. I saw my grandmother Eleanor's fierce, uncompromising eyes staring back at me. She had built this empire with grit, intelligence, and steel, and I had defended it with absolute fire. The saga of the Hanks and Kensington families serves as a brutal, unforgiving masterclass in the distinction between net worth and self-worth. They thought the value of a woman was measured by her willingness to submit, or the prestige of the people she allowed to walk all over her. They thought dignity was a commodity that could be bought with a stolen credit card, and that social status was a magical shield that protected them from the consequences of their own actions. I taught them the most expensive, devastating lesson of their miserable lives. True value is not what you steal, who you manipulate, or the aesthetic you project on social media. True power whispers. It creates, it endures, and it respects. It does not need to scream at a receptionist, belittle a spouse, or steal a family heirloom to validate its existence. If you ever find yourself hiding your strength, dimming your light, or shrinking your potential just so your partner doesn't feel weak, you are not in a relationship. You are in a cage, and it is entirely up to you to pick the lock and walk out. The sweetest revenge isn't screaming, crying, or begging for closure. The sweetest revenge is simply standing in the silence of the clouds, completely unbothered, letting them watch you burn with a brilliance they will never, ever be able to touch. I turned away from the edge of the roof, my heels clicking sharply against the concrete, and walked back toward the warm light of the elevator. The game was over. I had won, and I was exactly where I belonged. Thank you so much for riding out this incredible, infuriating, and ultimately satisfying journey with me. If Sophia's story resonated with you, or if you've ever had to cut a toxic, narcissistic person out of your life to protect your own peace, hit that like button and let me know your thoughts in the comments below.